When you try to understand Iran's regional behavior, the first mistake people often make is to look for something that resembles a traditional alliance system. They expect rigid blocks, formal treaties, and clear command structures, something similar to what you might see in NATO or other institutionalized security arrangements. But that is not how Iran operates. Its approach is more flexible, more adaptive, and in some ways more psychologically rooted in survival under constraint than in conventional power projection. What is often described as the axis of resistance is better understood not as a formal alliance in the traditional sense, but as a strategic architecture of influence. It is a network, loose in structure, but consistent in direction. And the key idea holding it together is not legal obligation or institutional membership. It is shared opposition to a set of regional and global forces that Iran perceives as threatening to its security and strategic autonomy. This distinction matters because it changes how we interpret intent. In formal alliances, cooperation is usually defined by contracts, treaties, and clearly articulated commitments. In Iran's model, cooperation is defined more by convergence of interests, ideological alignment at certain moments, and long-term strategic compatibility. That creates a system that is less predictable in appearance, but often more resilient in practice. At the core of this network is a simple strategic logic. Iran extends its influence outward, not primarily through direct territorial control or conventional military expansion, but through the cultivation of aligned actors that operate within their own local environments while still contributing to a broader regional balance that favors Iranian interests. This is important to understand clearly. These are not satellites in the classical imperial sense. They are not fully controlled from Tehran in a day-to-day operational way. Instead, they exist in a hybrid space, locally embedded, politically autonomous to varying degrees, but strategically connected through shared objectives, resources, training, and ideological framing. And this is where the psychological dimension becomes critical. Iran's strategy is built on the understanding that in the Middle East, power is not only centralized in states, it is also distributed through networks of political identity, religious affiliation, historical grievances, and local security dynamics. So instead of trying to dominate every layer directly, Iran operates by influencing key nodes within these networks, nodes that can amplify its reach far beyond its own borders. The result is a system that is less about control and more about alignment. And alignment, unlike control, does not require constant supervision. It requires continuity of interest and sufficient trust to sustain cooperation even in fragmented and unstable environments. This is why the concept of resistance is so central. It is not just a political slogan, it is a unifying narrative. It provides a shared language through which very different actors, state institutions, armed groups, political movements can interpret their own local struggles as part of a broader regional framework. That narrative coherence is what allows a network to function without formal hierarchy. From a strategic perspective, this creates a very different type of power structure. Instead of a pyramid, you have something closer to a web. Influence is transmitted through multiple pathways rather than a single chain of command. And in such a system, disruption at one point does not necessarily collapse the entire structure. It may weaken it, shift it, or force adaptation, but it does not automatically eliminate it. There is also a deeper philosophical logic at work here. Iran's regional strategy reflects a long-standing perception of vulnerability in an environment shaped by larger external powers and shifting regional coalitions. In that context, building influence through distributed networks is not just an option, it is a form of strategic insurance. If one node is pressured, others can compensate. If one theater becomes unstable, influence can be redirected elsewhere. This creates a system that is inherently adaptive. It is designed to survive fragmentation. And in a region where fragmentation is often the default condition rather than the exception, that adaptability becomes a form of strength. But it is important not to misunderstand what this system can and cannot do. It does not provide the kind of centralized, rapid, decisive control that a conventional state might exert over its military forces. Instead, it provides something different, persistent presence across multiple environments simultaneously. Not dominance in a single space, but relevance across many. And relevance in geopolitical terms is often underestimated because relevance means being part of the decision-making equation of other actors. It means that in any regional crisis, Iran-linked networks are not external observers. They are variables that must be accounted for. This is why the axis of resistance as a concept is less about formal structure and more about strategic density. It increases the number of points at which Iran is indirectly involved in regional dynamics. And the more points of involvement exist, the more difficult it becomes for any single actor to resolve regional challenges without taking that network into account. From the outside, this can sometimes appear fragmented or inconsistent. But internally, it is held together by a consistent strategic logic: preserve influence, maintain deterrence capacity, and ensure that Iran is never fully isolated from the key geopolitical processes shaping its neighborhood. And this leads to an important realization. In this model, strength is not measured by uniformity or central control. It is measured by resilience under pressure and the ability to remain embedded in multiple strategic environments at once. So, when we step back, what we are really looking at is not a traditional alliance system, but a distributed influence architecture, one that operates through alignment rather than command, through networks rather than institutions, and through adaptability rather than rigidity. And that brings us to a final reflection. In a region defined by instability and shifting power balances, influence is no longer just about who you can control directly. It is about where you remain present, even when control itself is no longer possible. If the broader structure of Iran's regional influence network is a web of distributed relationships, then Hezbollah is the point where that web becomes most visible, most developed, and most strategically significant. To understand Iran's regional power, you have to understand Hezbollah not just as a militant organization and not just as a political actor in Lebanon, but as a highly evolved example of how Iran translates influence into durable regional capability. What makes Hezbollah unique is that it exists simultaneously in three worlds at once. It is a political party, it is a social organization, and it is a military force. And that combination matters because it allows it to operate across the full spectrum of power inside institutions, within society, and on the battlefield. Very few non-state actors in modern history have achieved that level of integration. From Iran's perspective, Hezbollah is not just an ally. It is the most successful expression of its regional strategy. It represents the most mature form of what the broader axis of resistance is trying to achieve: an actor that is locally rooted, politically legitimate within its own environment, but strategically aligned with Iran's broader regional objectives. And here's the key point. Hezbollah's strength does not come only from its military capabilities, although those are significant. Its strength comes from its embeddedness. It is deeply integrated into Lebanese political life, social structures, and security dynamics. That embeddedness gives it resilience. It is not an external force imposed on a society. It is a force that has grown within it, adapted to it, and shaped itself through it. This creates a very different kind of strategic actor than a traditional state ally. In conventional alliances, military cooperation is often conditional, formal, and externally defined. With Hezbollah, the relationship is more organic. It is built through long-term training, financing, ideological alignment, and operational coordination, but it functions with a degree of autonomy that allows it to respond to local conditions in real time. And this autonomy is crucial. It allows Hezbollah to act as both a Lebanese actor and a regional extension of Iranian strategic depth. In practice, that means it can respond to local political dynamics in Lebanon while also contributing to broader regional calculations involving Israel, Syria, and beyond. From a strategic standpoint, this dual identity creates ambiguity. And ambiguity in conflict environments is not a weakness, it is a form of leverage. Because when an actor cannot be easily categorized as purely state-directed or purely independent, it complicates the response of external powers. It raises questions about escalation, attribution, and proportionality. But to understand Hezbollah's role fully, you have to also understand its psychological function within Iran's regional architecture. It is not just a military asset. It is a proof of concept. It demonstrates that Iran's model of influence through aligned non-state actors can evolve into something durable, structured, and operationally significant over time. In that sense, Hezbollah is both a tool and a message. It signals to other actors in the region that long-term alignment with Iran can produce meaningful strategic capacity. It also signals to adversaries that Iran's influence is not limited to rhetoric or indirect pressure. It can manifest in organized, capable, and sustained operational presence on the ground. There is also an important historical dimension here. Hezbollah emerged in a specific context of conflict and occupation, but over time it evolved into a much more complex institution. That evolution matters because it shows how regional actors in volatile environments often transform from purely military organizations into hybrid political military structures. Once that transformation happens, you become significantly harder to dislodge because they are no longer just fighting forces. They are part of the political ecosystem itself. This is where the concept of deterrence becomes more complex. Hezbollah is not simply a force that can be measured in conventional military terms. It is also a factor in political decision-making, regional calculations, and escalation dynamics. Its presence influences how other actors think about risk, timing, and response thresholds. And that brings us to a deeper strategic paradox. On one hand, Hezbollah increases Iran's ability to project influence near Israel's northern frontier, creating a persistent point of pressure. On the other hand, its deep integration into Lebanese society means that any major conflict involving Hezbollah is not just a military confrontation. It becomes a broader political and social crisis with regional implications. So what emerges is a structure that is both powerful and constrained. Powerful because it extends Iran's strategic reach in a highly capable and embedded way. Constrained because its deep roots in a specific national context limit how and when it can be used without significant escalation risks. From Iran's perspective, that balance is actually part of the design. Hezbollah is not meant to be a constantly activated tool. It is meant to be a standing capability, present, credible, and influential, even when not actively engaged. Its value lies not only in what it does, but in what it makes others assume it might do under certain conditions, and that assumption shapes behavior. It shapes Israeli planning, regional calculations, and broader deterrence dynamics. In that sense, Hezbollah's influence extends far beyond its immediate operational activity. It functions as a strategic variable in the wider regional equation, but there is also a broader philosophical insight here. Hezbollah represents a form of power that does not fit neatly into traditional categories of state and non-state, war and politics, internal and external. It exists in between those categories, and in doing so, it reflects a broader transformation in how power is organized in the modern Middle East. We are no longer dealing with systems where power is fully centralized in states or fully dispersed in societies. We are dealing with hybrid structures that operate across multiple layers simultaneously, and Hezbollah is one of the clearest examples of that hybridization in practice. So, when we step back, what we see is not just a military actor, but a node in a much larger strategic system, one that connects local realities in Lebanon to regional dynamics across the Middle East, and ultimately to Iran's broader approach to security and influence. And that leads us to a final reflection. In today's regional order, the most consequential actors are not always the ones with the most formal power. They are the ones that are deeply embedded, highly adaptive, and capable of shaping decisions far beyond the boundaries of where they physically operate. When we look beyond Hezbollah and focus on the broader geography of Iran's regional strategy, what becomes immediately clear is that Iran does not think in terms of single theaters or isolated conflicts. It thinks in terms of distributed pressure. Iraq, Syria, and Yemen are not separate files in Tehran's strategic thinking. They are interconnected arenas in a wider system of influence, each reinforcing the others in different ways. And this is where Iran's model becomes particularly interesting from a geopolitical perspective. It is not about controlling territory in the traditional sense. It is about maintaining leverage across multiple fronts at the same time in a way that forces other regional and global actors to constantly manage multiple crises simultaneously. Let's start with Iraq. Iraq is perhaps the most politically sensitive and strategically important node in Iran's regional system after Lebanon. It sits directly on Iran's border, shares deep historical, religious, and economic ties, and contains a complex landscape of political factions and armed groups. Over time, Iran has developed strong relationships with a range of Iraqi militias and political actors, particularly within the Popular Mobilization Forces framework. But again, it is important not to think of this as simple control. It is more accurate to think of it as embedded influence. Many of these groups operate within Iraq's formal political system while also maintaining independent armed capabilities and external relationships. Iran's role is often to provide support, coordination, and strategic alignment rather than direct day-to-day command. The result is a kind of dual structure. On the surface, Iraq functions as a sovereign state with formal institutions. Beneath that surface, there is a parallel ecosystem of armed and political actors that can shape outcomes in moments of crisis. For Iran, this creates a critical buffer zone. It ensures that any major regional confrontation involving Iran cannot be contained strictly within Iranian territory. It will inevitably have spillover effects into Iraq's internal dynamics. Now move east of that into Syria. Syria represents a different kind of strategic environment. While Iraq is about proximity and political penetration, Syria is about strategic depth and corridor connectivity. Iran's involvement in Syria has been driven largely by the need to maintain a continuous land corridor that connects its territory through Iraq into Lebanon. But beyond logistics, Syria has become a long-term stabilization investment from Iran's perspective. By supporting the Assad government and maintaining aligned militia presence in key areas, Iran has ensured that it retains a foothold in the Levant, regardless of shifting regional alliances or external pressure. Here again, the structure is not purely hierarchical. It is layered. Syrian state forces, Iranian advisors, and aligned militias operate in overlapping spaces with different levels of coordination and autonomy. This creates a complex operational environment where influence is distributed rather than centralized. From a strategic standpoint, Syria provides Iran with something extremely valuable: continuity. Even in a highly fragmented regional environment, it gives Iran a sustained presence in the heart of the Levant, close to Israel, close to the Mediterranean, and close to multiple regional fault lines. That presence is not just military, it is geopolitical positioning over the long term. And then we move further south to Yemen, which at first glance might seem disconnected from Iran's immediate regional sphere. But strategically, Yemen plays a very different role. It is about extending pressure far beyond Iran's immediate neighborhood into critical global maritime routes. The Houthis in Yemen represent one of the most striking examples of how Iran's influence model operates at a distance. Through a combination of ideological alignment, technical support, and strategic convergence, the Houthis have become capable of exerting pressure on one of the most important maritime choke points in the world, the Red Sea, and access routes toward the Suez Canal. This is where the logic of distributed pressure becomes fully visible. Yemen is not about territorial control or direct governance. It is about the ability to influence a strategic corridor that has global economic significance. Even limited disruptions in this area can have disproportionate effects on global shipping costs, energy markets, and international supply chains. So, when you put Iraq, Syria, and Yemen together, what emerges is not a collection of separate conflicts, but a structured system of pressure points. Each theater serves a different function. Iraq creates proximity and political leverage. Syria provides continuity and strategic depth. Yemen extends influence into global maritime systems. And the critical insight is this: Iran does not need to dominate any one of these theaters completely in order to achieve strategic impact. Instead, it benefits from maintaining enough presence in each of them to ensure that no major regional or international calculation can be made without taking Iranian-linked actors into account. This creates a form of multi-front strategic engagement that is less about winning decisively in any single location and more about ensuring persistent relevance across multiple crises simultaneously. And relevance in this context is power, because it forces other actors, regional states, global powers, and international coalitions to factor Iran into every major equation of stability and escalation. There is also a psychological dimension to this distributed model. It introduces uncertainty into the planning of adversaries. When influence is spread across multiple theaters, it becomes harder to predict where pressure will emerge next or how actions in one region might trigger responses in another. That uncertainty itself becomes a strategic asset. But there is a cost to this approach as well. Managing multiple fronts requires constant coordination, sustained relationships, and careful calibration of escalation risks. It is not a system that allows for simplicity. It is inherently complex, and complexity in geopolitics always carries its own vulnerabilities. Still, from Iran's perspective, this complexity is not accidental. It is structural. It reflects a worldview in which security is not achieved by controlling a single decisive battlefield, but by ensuring that influence is distributed widely enough that no single confrontation can fully determine the outcome. So when we step back, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen are not isolated arenas. They are interconnected pressure nodes in a broader regional architecture, one that allows Iran to operate across multiple strategic layers at once, right? And that leads us to a final reflection. In today's Middle East, influence is no longer defined by control over territory alone. It is defined by the ability to remain present, active, and consequential across multiple crises at the same time, even when none of those crises are fully under your control. If we step back from the individual theaters, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and look at the system as a whole, what ultimately holds Iran's regional influence network together is not just military capability or ideological alignment. It is a deliberate strategic approach that combines asymmetric warfare with what international politics often calls plausible deniability. At first glance, these may sound like technical concepts, but in reality, they describe something much more fundamental, a way of operating in the international system that reduces direct exposure while maximizing indirect impact. Let's start with asymmetric warfare. In simple terms, asymmetric warfare is about avoiding direct confrontation with stronger conventional powers by using methods that do not require matching them symmetrically. Iran does not try to compete with regional or global adversaries on their own terms, large-scale conventional armies, direct state-to-state war, or full-spectrum battlefield dominance. Instead, it operates through methods that are lower cost, more flexible, and harder to predict. These include supporting non-state actors, enabling missile and drone capabilities across multiple theaters, and using indirect engagement to apply pressure where conventional militaries are least efficient. But the key insight here is not just the method, it is the logic behind it. Asymmetric warfare is fundamentally about redefining the battlefield. It shifts competition away from areas where Iran is structurally weaker and into areas where conventional superiority is less decisive. And this is where the psychological dimension becomes important. Asymmetric strategies are not just about physical impact, they are about shaping the decision-making environment of stronger actors. They introduce uncertainty, fragmentation, and delay into the responses of opponents who are used to operating in more structured, conventional frameworks. Now layer onto this the concept of plausible deniability, and the system becomes even more strategically sophisticated. Plausible deniability is not simply about hiding involvement. It is about maintaining enough ambiguity that direct attribution becomes politically and strategically costly for adversaries. When actions cannot be cleanly attributed to a state actor, responses become more complicated. They are no longer purely military decisions. They become political calculations involving escalation risk, legal justification, and international perception. This ambiguity creates what we can think of as a strategic buffer zone. It sits between action and response, slowing down the automaticity of retaliation. In conventional state-to-state conflict, an attack leads relatively quickly to attribution and then to response. In a system built on proxies and indirect actors, that chain becomes less linear. It becomes contested, debated, and often deliberately obscured. From Iran's perspective, this is not accidental, it is structural. The value of ambiguity is that it increases the cost of response for adversaries. When responsibility is unclear, every response carries a higher risk of escalation miscalculation. That hesitation, even if temporary, is strategically meaningful. And when you combine asymmetric warfare with plausible deniability, you get a system that is optimized for what we might call controlled pressure. It is not about overwhelming force. It is about sustained, calibrated disruption that remains below the threshold of full-scale conventional war. This is where Iran's regional strategy becomes particularly interesting. It is not designed to produce decisive battlefield victories in the traditional sense. It is designed to shape the strategic environment in which other actors make decisions. It introduces friction into their planning processes. It forces them to consider not just immediate threats, but secondary and tertiary consequences across multiple theaters. In practical terms, this means that Iran can influence regional dynamics without needing to fully commit its own forces at every point of tension. It can rely on a distributed network of aligned actors who operate with varying degrees of autonomy but share overlapping strategic objectives. And this brings us to a deeper philosophical point about modern conflict. In traditional warfare models, power is often measured by concentration, how much force can be applied at a single point in time, as so shao in ease. But in Iran's model, power is increasingly about distribution, how influence can be spread across multiple points in a system so that pressure is continuous rather than concentrated. That shift has major implications. It means that conflict is no longer confined to clearly defined battlefields. It becomes dispersed across political, military, economic, and informational domains simultaneously. And when conflict is dispersed, it becomes harder to resolve through a single decisive outcome. There is also an important feedback loop here. The more asymmetric and deniable Iran's methods become, the more its adversaries are forced to adapt their own responses. That often leads to more complex deterrent strategies, increased reliance on intelligence, and more cautious decision-making under uncertainty. In other words, the strategy reshapes not only actions, but also perceptions and behaviors on both sides. But this system is not without constraints. The reliance on indirect actors means that control is never absolute. Local dynamics, regional politics, and internal motivations of partner groups all influence outcomes in ways that cannot be fully directed from the center. So, while Iran can shape direction and provide support, it cannot fully dictate every outcome across its network. This creates a strategic trade-off, flexibility and reach on one hand versus full control on the other. But for Iran, in its current regional environment, that trade-off is acceptable because it prioritizes resilience and influence over centralized command. So, when we step back and look at asymmetric warfare combined with plausible deniability, what we are really seeing is a system designed for operating under constraints, financial, military, and geopolitical, while still maintaining strategic relevance across a volatile region. And perhaps the most important insight is this. In today's Middle East, power is no longer defined solely by the ability to win open wars. It is increasingly defined by the ability to shape conflict without fully owning it, to influence outcomes without fully controlling them, and to remain present in crises without becoming fully exposed to their consequences. Because in the end, the most sophisticated form of power is not always the ability to dominate the battlefield, but the ability to ensure that no battlefield in the region can ever be fully separated from your influence.